Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo.
You hear a lot of criticism of the corporations that they don't care about their people, that they'll sort of discard people when they get old so that they don't have to pay benefits to them, and that corporations move people around and don't really take into consideration their needs and their desires as family members and so on. So maybe that kind of criticism of the corporations opens up ethical questions from another side, not so much institutional, but at a more personal level.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Dr. Thomas Klein, Professor of Marketing at the University of Toledo. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of individuals and families in corporate life. Here's Father Bacik.
Tom, you and I have had interesting conversations privately in the past on economic and religious issues, and I think it might be good if we did that on the air now. Are you open to that kind of discussion?
By all means.
Maybe you could say something about your background on this. When you did your own degree and so on, what kind of training do you get in general economics and so on?
Well, we obviously had a good deal of classical economic or traditional economic theory, marginal analysis, statistical training, and so forth. And in my own case, a fairly healthy dollop of what we might call institutional analysis, the understanding of how governments and businesses and other kinds of organizations actually operate in a social environment.
And I know your specialty of late has been the whole area of business ethics. I think you were out in Berkeley for a while working on that?
Yes, at the Institute for Social Ethics at the Graduate Theological Union there, as well as in the School of Business at University of California.
That was a good experience for you. I know I've heard some of the fruits of that work in the past in talks that you have given, and I know that you're very familiar with that whole area, and I think I'm in a position to make a contribution on it. I hope that you'll be able to do that as time goes on. Let's draw on that a bit, Tom, and talk about economic questions. Let's look at corporations, and let's do a bit about how corporations end up dealing with the people within their structures. I'm thinking that the whole, you hear a lot of criticism of the corporations that they don't care about their people, that they'll sort of discard people when they get old so that they don't have to pay benefits to them, or that they close down operations in particular parts of the country and simply move to where they can get labor cheaper and so on. I guess that's often claimed in relationship to the third world, that the corporations move there so they can take advantage of that cheap labor, and that ends up putting people in the United States out of work and so on. And that corporations move people around and don't really take into consideration their needs and their desires as family members and so on. So maybe that kind of criticism of the corporations opens up ethical questions from another side, not so much institutional, but at a more personal level.
Well, I think corporations are learning in recent years that the people element is I think corporations in general, let's say, not all corporations, learning that the people element is very critical in the organization's success. I suppose what happens in the development of a corporation that grows in size and gets more and more people as you look at that organization from the top end, from the chief executive officer's viewpoint, or perhaps even relatively higher up middle management, you tend to see people as not really people as human beings at all, but as simply instruments of production, to use a kind of loaded term. And therefore you deal with those instruments of production which happen to be human, just happen to be human, in much the same way as you deal with machines that when they cease to work the way you want them to work, you discard them. Or when you see one that that works particularly well, you reward it. You buy more of them. And, of course, ultimately, in the course of trial and error, in ways in which the machines don't, the people tend to react. We have labor unions that are a product of solidarity, really, in the late 19th century, well up to the present period, where individual workers came together to defend themselves against those kinds of attitudes, to seek better working conditions, better wages, and better fringe benefits in the form of pensions and health plans and so on.
If we look at that historically, Tom, we could go back to in the 19th century and see the real basis for Marx's critique of the industrialized system as he knew it, and the terrible abuses of child labor and long hours and no benefits for the people and so on.
Certainly,
I think
undignified.
Very, terrible kinds of abuses in the early years of the Industrial Revolution, and social critics, I guess, have been seeing that difficulty as we've moved along. I guess your reading of it is that there has been gradual improvement in that over the years, and
I would
all
say
the way
gradual,
up to the
and
present moment.
in some cases dramatic improvement, depending on what period in history you want to look at. If you like the 30s, the union movement brought about tremendous changes in working conditions and wages.
I must say that with the whole labor union movement, I've always been proud of the tradition and my own Catholic heritage on that. I think that the leadership has done an excellent job, from the popes championing the right of working men to organize, and the bishops in the United States being seen as a friend of labor throughout all of the years, and trying really much of the New Deal legislation that was finally passed, I know, was contained in a document issued by the American bishops back in 1919, and a program for social progress in the United States. And so I think that that has been good. I think that it represents maybe one kind of understanding of how the corporations function vis-a-vis people. That is, at times the progress has been made because pressure has been brought to bear on them, either by the moral institutions of the society, like the churches or the press or the universities, and on the other hand, the adversarial role played by the labor unions, so that the working men have had to sort of fight for that kind of progress. It seems like I don't know, the outsider's view is that it's always been given grudgingly somehow, that
I think
be forced to do this.
There are obviously many examples where it has been given grudgingly. I think in part that reflects the traditionally conservative views of managers in corporations who saw their power threatened, and so, in fact, yes, the goodies that went with the union movement were given grudgingly. I don't think you should overlook, by the way, a history that shows that corporate executives often have a good deal of social vision on their own initiative. Even if we go back to the early 19th century industry, which I suppose in a sense is what Marx was reacting to. Admittedly paternal, a stance that probably would not be accepted in modern society, but where the leaders, the owners, the investors in the early mills of New England took great pains to build factories and build living arrangements for their employees, which by European standards were quite advanced in terms of providing privacy to the individuals as opposed to living in dormitories, in terms of providing what by those lights in those times were very limited working hours. People only worked 10, 12 hours a day instead of working 16. People who had Sundays off and Saturday afternoons off to read, to go to church, and to walk in the woods, which were bought as part of the factory complex to provide a kind of natural environment within which work could take place, a dramatic departure from the urban excesses of England and Western Europe.
I think it's only fair to point out how this kind of thing continues today. I mean, I know situations. We know the Anderson Company in our own community here, which does so much for their employees. I think of a friend of mine telling me the Dow Chemical Company up in Midland, Michigan, built special complexes for their single secretaries so they would have a social situation and so on. And I think the National Cash Register down in Dayton, which has a pool and golf course that their employees can use, and so
All their
on.
employees.
So yeah, so that it's interesting that you see that kind of thing still operative today, and I suppose any total analysis has to bring out that. You put it in paternalistic terms, at least at times, and maybe also we could put it in terms of an enlightened self-interest that often they have found if they keep their employees happy in that way, they're going to produce more and be more productive and so on.
Well, I think that, you know, the the press today is inclined to look at Japan as an ideal one that does much more of this than we do in the United States. And to be sure, the corporations, if you like to call them that, in Japan, are really little families, or maybe big families is a better way to describe them, in the sense that they have a much more total living environment for their employees. To some extent it's paternal, but what actually emerges is involves a good deal of participation by the individual employees too.
I notice there's books out claiming that our American corporations ought to learn something from the Japanese experience and find different ways of dealing with their people and making them feel more part of the process and caring for them in various ways. I'm never too sure how much you can transfer that from one culture to the other. I think the Japanese culture is more communal to begin with, and we live in such an individualistic culture. But I would like to think that there's certain correctives that could be built in, and that ways in which corporations could bring the people into decision-making processes, for example, make them feel part of the total production picture, take better care of them in difficult times, and so on.
Well, I think we have if you have an understanding of human beings as whole, corporations over time begin to reflect that in their policies towards their employees, and I would add toward their customers as well, and perhaps toward the other publics that they have to deal with. That ultimately, at the bottom of all this is a moral ideal, isn't it? That the people with whom we deal are treated as more than mere means. Now, I think the mere means construct is one that well describes what we would say is the worst habits of corporations, that their employees, their customers, and so forth are mere means to their own ends of profit or whatever.
I think if you go back to Adam Smith's time, and when he wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, in insisting on the great value of the division of labor, and that this is how you would get better productivity if everyone was doing a tiny single job that they were very skilled at, and in making the total product, he saw that what this would do to the worker, that the worker would be a cog in the machine, and it would be a depersonalizing kind of influence on him. And I think his observation still holds true. I mean, how many people who work for large companies feel that? If you talk to them, they feel as though they're used as things, that they're disposable in some way, that their opinion is not valued, and so on. I think the thing you hear very often, and I think that for good reason. I think the way the thing is actually structured, people are used like that.
Well, I think corporations are not alone guilty in that. I suppose to some extent families operate that way, and certainly governments may and frequently do choose to ignore their constituents from time to time for their own purposes.
And as do churches as well.
As perhaps churches even
Yes.
too. The notion of wholeness, though, I think deserves a little more consideration in that education, okay, we'll use the notion of the moral cultural institutions or the moral cultural system as in Novak's Spirit of Democratic Capitalism that we've referred to in the past. I think the fact that the people who govern business as well as the people who govern political systems are subject to information, to enlightenment, to encouragement, not necessarily in a political way, but simply in sharing ideas, that they begin to appreciate their own wholeness more. If I don't want to overwork that word because I certainly don't want to define it. But as they appreciate their own wholeness more, then they very quickly come to an understanding that other people have that wholeness too, and that we simply can't look at a customer or as an employee as just a cog in the economic system. Smith's notion of division of labor, of course, is a very, very powerful economic idea. Like all great ideas, of course, it carries with it a two-edged sword. We pursued the division of labor idea in modern management thought or historical management thought to a great extent down through the writings of Frederick W. Taylor. That's a word that in this area might be associated with an Ohio State basketball coach, but in fact was an industrial engineer who wrote a good deal in the early part of the century about what we would today call human factors engineering, the notion of putting together production systems based on the capabilities of human beings as instruments of production. We carried that to the extent that human beings rebelled, and in fact, I suppose managers' own sensibilities rebelled against what they saw happening, and so now we worry about moving people from place to place. We worry about dislocating people. In Toledo in the past several years, of course, there have been a tremendous number of layoffs. It's interesting to see how many corporations have dealt with those layoffs. In fact, they have built in what we call outplacement systems. Outplacement provides counseling and a good deal of assistance to find another job, and the experience is that many of the people who left our corporations, perhaps even a majority of the people who left Toledo area corporations in the last few years, have found through the outplacement process, which was paid for by their previous employers, found better jobs than they had previously. So to some extent, that's a matter of enlightened self-interest. That's the economic argument for it, of course. But also it's a reflection of the fact that people who run organizations, corporations, or other kinds of organizations probably have a certain decency towards the plight of other human beings who are caught in circumstances that aren't favorable and that they had very little to do with, and therefore deserve some redress. And that isn't a task that necessarily has to fall to government to provide.
Tom, let's look a little bit at the way the corporations influence family life. I could see it from a couple different angles. One is that corporate life is very difficult on families. For one thing, people have to move. I've had friends like that who are settled in a community, and suddenly the corporation says, you're going to move on. And if they want to move up in the structure of the organization, they end up moving, even if it means going to a foreign country. So they are uprooted in this way. I guess another kind of thing is the kind of demands that are made upon one within the corporate life, the time element, the commitment to the corporation. Seems as though for some individuals at least that becomes all-consuming. They begin up forgetting about their families. I know I end up counseling people in that very situation who are so bound up in their job they forget their kids. They don't play with their kids, and they don't have time for their wives, and spouses seem to end up neglecting one another, and we end up with a lot of difficulties, divorces and so on. Not just that it's caused by that, but it seems to be a contributing factor.
Well, there's probably a workaholic streak in our culture to some extent, and the modern corporation certainly takes advantage of that. And
well, maybe it does more than just that, however. It also
rewards it,
causes it, and maybe some people aren't workaholics, but if they're going to make it on their job or keep their jobs, they're just called upon. Those kind of demands are put upon them. So that's certainly, it seems to me, one side of it, that corporate life is difficult on families. I suppose the counter kind of argument is that corporations like to strengthen family life, that they're happier if people have good family life because then they'll be better workers, and that some people at least try to be aware of that. Some companies try to do things for families and so on that will enhance their family life or encourage their men, if they're having family troubles, they'll give them more time off and things like that to try to deal with the problem.
I think they're more tolerant of family problems, let's put it that way. I think most corporations have a great deal of difficulty getting involved in family life. I think there's having done a little bit of work in this area in the last year, I hear corporations saying, yes, we're concerned about it. Yeah, we want, if it's a matter of having time off, if it's a matter of certainly through the health packages and so forth, providing for counseling and so on, we want to, facilitate that. Why? They really don't want to get involved in the family life. I think this is a fair statement. I don't think they see family life in terms other than bad family life hurts worker productivity, quality, increases absenteeism, and things like that. It'd be interesting. I'm sure there are some corporations, particularly small companies, that feel much more comfortable playing a closer role in family life. But that's a two-edged sword. Who is the corporate president who should tell me or you or anybody else what my relationship with my kids ought to be, or whether I should go someplace with my wife or not?
Yeah, it is indeed. It surely is a delicate matter.
Yeah.
There, one could see that. Tom, I want to introduce a bit of perspective might be offered by my own Christian tradition on this and our common Catholic heritage. There's been sort of an insistence in the papal writings and so on what we might call participatory democracy at the work site. That it's important for people to have a say in how things are run, to feel that they are part of the whole thing. So it's coming not just out of a question of efficiency that maybe we get in the Japanese model that you were talking about before, but that it grows out of the right and dignity of the worker, that a worker has a right to have a say in how things go, and that it's part of our human dignity to feel that we are a shaper of our own destiny and that we have a share in the products of our labor, kind of critique that Marx made, of course, that we were alienated from the product of our labor. And I think that the Church really has a good point in pushing that, and a lot of that would seem to be able to be done in the shops, in the factories, in the decision-making process, where people's dignity would be respected and they'd be consulted and have a voice in how things were going to go.
I think that's a theological position. I would say that that beyond the question of productivity is what you might call a legalistic view of the contract between the worker and the company. That, in a sense, the worker has a share in the corporation, and that he invests his time and his labors and so forth, and that the corporation thus has a duty to allow him to participate. That works because increasingly today we have a much more educated worker population who can, in fact, both from the standpoint of being close to his work and from the standpoint of his general education, can contribute to the efforts of the organization, can offer suggestions that substantially improve whatever it is that the corporation is up to, from a production standpoint, from a selling standpoint, from a product design standpoint, and so forth. And companies that have used reward systems and suggestion systems have, without a doubt, benefited from that involvement, and those who discourage and look the other way and sort of pretend that capability doesn't exist have been hurt by it in many cases.
Another side to the Church's insistence on improving the social order has been the suggestion that the idea of the co-ownership of the means of production by the part of workers. The workers would actually be a part of management in a way and part of ownership. This is an idea, I guess, that is not particularly open in the United States, I don't think. As I understand it, it's done more in Western Europe. But I know some cases, for example, when the mills closed in Youngstown, one of the ideas was that they would get up the capital and be able to buy those mills, have them owned by the workers, and have the workers then run them. And I think that I know there's situations where it has worked. It didn't work out well in Youngstown, but other situations where the workers have taken over, and you'll see it on the news periodically where people say, oh, I work so much harder now, we're producing a better product, and so on. I always wonder where those things would go, but it would seem to me that could be a step forward again in the evolution of capitalism as we know it in our own country and as we look at the role of corporations. worker ownership.
Yeah, that's got to be on the future agenda. Of course, we are seeing, as you mentioned, more and more worker-owned enterprises. We're also seeing, I think, a reemergence of the cooperative scheme in some areas. Obviously, in agriculture, this has been a major force for the past 50 or 80 years. But
why does that have to be so future on the agenda? Why can't it be?
Well, I think it happens. It comes about. These are it's very difficult to take a major corporation and figure out how can we turn this over to our employees. In fact, what's happening are let's give you a couple of examples.
You can't give too many, Tom, because of time constraints.
Well, in fact, part of the fringe benefit package for many employees includes share ownership, and you also have pension plans that own much of the large corporations in the United States, to give you two examples of how, in fact, we are moving.
We are moving in that direction,
yes.
And again, that would be a good step forward. Tom, you're very positive when you speak about the corporate life and the business world. You, I guess, see a lot of the good things that go on there and have a sense of the progress that has been made. I know that from the Christian viewpoint, one has to remain in judgment upon all of that we can't baptize a given system, and we have to realize that Christianity is not tied to any one social or economic system, and that we have to keep trying to reform what we have, and if it will not be responsive to human needs, to try to make it be that way. And so we've been trying to see in one way or another how corporations affect individuals and family life. And you pointed out a number of good things, and I think it's probably important to keep the critique in mind as well. The overall goal, of course, is to help in many ways to humanize our society.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Dr. Thomas Klein, professor of marketing at the University of Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was individuals and families in corporate life. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.